and welcome aboard. Thank you again for joining us. Beth is the Director of Outreach Education for Ohio Attorney General's Office, and I am going to turn it over to Beth. Thank you.
All right. Well, Linda, thank you for inviting me this evening. And thank you, folks. It sounds like some good work is going on up in Lorain County. I'm very familiar with Lorain County, and I may be one of the older ones on the call, but there used to be this football conference called the Buckeye Conference, and I was from Marion Harding. And so I spent many a long night on the road to football and basketball games at Lorain Senior, Admiral King, and Elyria. So I know quite a bit of the area up there. The Buckeye Conference has now outlived us, Mr. Love. We've outlived it. So I'm glad to be a part of this discussion tonight. Now, one of the things that seems to happen when I try to share my screen is I often can't see chats, and we're such a small group that I hope that as we go along, if you have questions or you want further explanation or you want to argue over something, which I love, that you'll just shout it out and we'll spend our time doing what's most useful to all of you. It's funny because times have changed a lot from a year ago. And if any of you did strategic planning in the last 2 years and you had this on your plate for how 2020 was going to be, I'll give you $20. Imagine all that planning and, hard work that's been done to plot out very carefully what we think is going to be best for the folks we serve in our communities. And then this happens and it's kind of starting all over at go. And I know that it's hard. It's incredibly difficult. Oh, someone is from Waldo. Julie?
Yeah.
How about that?
I know. It's like small world.
Exactly. I'm a Prexy though, but a big GNR fan. So I send everybody to Waldo, which has the best bologna sandwiches in the world. If you're going down Route 23 ever, you should stop at Waldo and try their bologna sandwich. It's raved about across the country. So go Vikings. So this has been a horribly difficult, trying time for everybody. And my heart breaks for the really tough things that are going on to charities throughout our state. And so for all of you who are doing important work out there, Godspeed in your efforts, because it is tough. And one of the things we spend a lot of time focusing on is trying to help good people do good things the right way. And now more than ever, we need boards and leaders of charities that can really jump in and think in creative and innovative ways about how to, respond in these times, remain relevant in our communities, and think about all those folks that, increasing numbers of folks that need your services. So thank you for tuning in tonight to a topic that I love and get excited about, board governance stuff. So I'm going to see if we can make the share screen work, but I won't be able to see you all. And hopefully you're seeing a PowerPoint slide. Anybody? All right. Yay for when technology works. Sometimes it doesn't. And isn't it wonderful that this happened now instead of 10 years ago when we didn't have all these platforms that we could continue being in communication with each other? So we call this training Minding the Business While Changing the World, because what we find is that people are serving on boards of organizations because they're really passionate about the cause or the particular programs that are offered by a charity. But being a cheerleader is not enough. There are really important legal obligations that apply to particularly board members and then key staff people of organizations. And so that's what Linda asked me to talk about tonight. So please shout out as we go. If your organization has figured out a genius way to handle things, or if you have questions, whatever the case might be, um, please know that, we are the regulators of the charitable world in Ohio, at least. And when you say you're a regulator, sometimes people immediately assume that you hate babies and kittens and cute things, that you are someone who is soulless because you're a regulator. But in the charitable sector, we know how important the work that you all are doing is, and how many different people rely on the various programs you offer. And if you think about all the ways that charities touch our lives and the lives of those that we love, it is kind of mind blowing. And so we start out with a real level of respect and appreciation for the work that goes into making charities run in an appropriate way. And so we say thank you for that work. Even though we are regulators, we know it takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears from a lot of people to make things work right. So thank you for stepping up to the plate and being willing to jump in and make our world better. So one of the things that we try to do is put tools in the hands of people that need to know about some of these issues. And we're trying to help good people do good things the right way, because if you fail to do things the right way, it can seriously jeopardize the long-term viability of your organization. And then you won't be able to do those cool programs that people rely on. And so we spend time, and back in the olden days, I used to travel around the state where there'd be gatherings in communities for people from various charitable organizations, or at statewide conferences, and talk about board governance. If you go to our webpage, and by the way, we have a brand new webpage that is just all charitable information, and you can find that at charitable.ohioago.gov. And we got a lot of feedback from folks that people had troubles finding our information on the Attorney General's big webpage that had all kinds of things that our agency covers. So we got our own website. And so at charitable.ohioago.gov, you can find everything that we're going to talk about today and more. Anything that applies to the Attorney General's work and the charitable community is all in this one spot. We want to help people do things the right way. And so we have a number of resources there. There are two publications that are our best sellers. One is the Guide for Charity Board Members that you see pictured here, and the other is Avoiding Theft. And I think every board member ought to take a look at these publications every year, just to remind yourself of what the job is, because sometimes you're running so fast just trying to keep up with, the programmatic work that your organization does. Sometimes it's helpful to step back and to think with a different hat on, like, are we living up to our obligations? How is the health of our board? How are we doing in being responsive as leaders to our obligations that we have with this organization? So please take a look at those publications. We do a webinar on the first Wednesday of every month at noon on board governance. We also do every month on the third Wednesday at noon on the charitable registration system. There are pre-recorded versions of both of those webinars on this webpage. So should you have trouble sleeping some night, you could turn that on and listen to me talking about conflict of interest. But it's also something that some boards are watching together as a group, and then having a discussion afterwards about maybe some areas that they might want to take a look at in terms of their operations. Sometimes the board will say, hey, here's a link to this webinar, watch it before our meeting next Tuesday, because we're going to talk about this. So again, we want to give people the tools that can be important in helping them to continue making Ohio a better place. We have a nonprofit newsletter, and that goes out by email. And then we try to let people know when things arise, when there's changes in the law, or things people ought to know when unexpected things like pandemics happen, things that might be helpful for charitable leaders to know about or think about in terms of how to protect the organization and go forward. So take a look at our webpage, and if you have suggestions for additional tools that would be helpful, we're all ears. And while I'm thinking about it, how about if I give you all my direct email right now? It's beth.short, SHORT, at ohioattorneygeneral.gov, all written out. So if you run into challenges, while we can't give you legal advice, we'll try to point you in the right direction. Or if you have suggestions, please let us know. So it's beth.short at ohioattorneygeneral.gov. Now, many people are really surprised when they find out that the Attorney General's office is involved in charities. Sometimes they think of us just as, our Bureau of Criminal Identification and like, NCIS and all those television shows where they have the crime specialists out there. But being the regulator and the overseer of the charitable sector is actually the oldest responsibility that our office has. And this goes back to the Middle Ages, back to jolly old England, where people would sometimes leave behind money for maybe the orphans in a village. That was very common back then. And sometimes the trustees would help the orphans in a village. And sometimes the trustees helped themselves and instead bought, faster horses or better suits of armor, whatever they spent funny money on back then. And so in 1601, they developed the Statute of Charitable Uses. And that says the Attorney General shall have the authority to stand in the shoes of the beneficiaries and force the trustees to do the right thing. And so that remains the focus of the work in our section every day. Is we're standing in the shoes of those who donors or others invested in to make sure they get services, and making sure that that's what funds are being used for, and they're not walking out the door being used for better suits of armor or something. And so we do our work every day, thinking about senior citizens or about those with substance abuse problems or children, whatever the cause of charities might be. That's kind of the lens through which we view our work. And when we talk about the charitable sector in Ohio, we're talking about this big, diverse community of all kinds of organizations. Some are extraordinarily complex, large businesses with millions and millions in assets, maybe hundreds of employees. And some may be very grassroots, such as a grandmother's reading club in a local park. No staff, all volunteer, no resources. And so you can be anywhere on that continuum. And if you are a leader of a group and on the board, your legal obligations, whether it's a big group or a small group, are exactly identical. So when you're a board member with my grandmother's reading club, or you're a board member with the Cleveland Clinic Foundation, your job is exactly the same. I'm going to run through some basics that people sometimes get confused about, that often are rooted in the startup of an organization, and some people fail to keep these things in mind throughout the life of the organization. But let's assume that you need to start a new charity. And I don't say that lightly, because many times we find people who are starting new charities because they have some new idea about how to help the community, but they really haven't thought through how they're going to commit to running this entity like a business, like it needs to be operated. And so I often tell people, stop. Have you thought about partnering with someone else who does similar types of work in a community? Have you thought about maybe doing it through a church until you get your feet on the ground and determine if there's ongoing energy and excitement about it? But let's assume that there's a brand new high school that's built in the community, Anywhere High School, and they're going to need to establish a new athletic booster group. So our first stop is going to be to the Ohio Secretary of State's office. They handle all the filings of anyone doing business in the state of Ohio. And assuming that no one else is using the name Anywhere Booster Club, we're going to file to become incorporated as a nonprofit. Now, you're not required to incorporate, but there are a lot of good legal reasons to incorporate. So we're going to incorporate Anywhere Booster Group. And assuming we fill out the paperwork properly, they're going to say, congratulations, welcome to the state of Ohio. When we file that, those articles of incorporation, we also need to designate a statutory agent, and that's an entity or person who will be the official recipient of any official kind of correspondence. So if someone dies in the state of California and leaves $2 million to Anywhere Boosters, the California lawyer is going to go on to the Secretary of State's website, as they would in any state. They're going to look up the name of the organization, find who the statutory agent is, and send a letter to them saying, check's in the mail. What we sometimes discover is that people don't routinely make sure that the statutory agent they have on file is a good current address or contact. And they say, oh my goodness, Mrs. Smith moved to Florida 8 years ago. So there are a number of reasons you need to have ongoing connections with the Secretary of State. One, every 5 years, you need to file a continued existence statement with the Secretary of State's office that says, we're still around, don't let anyone else use our name. And I always suggest that if you're on the board of an organization, at the beginning of every program year, go into the Secretary of State's listing, look up your organization, see what it says there. Hopefully it says that you're still an active corporation. It will tell you what year that magical filing, the continued existence filing, is due. And so if you check every year, you're not going to miss that 5th year when it's due. And then thirdly, check to see who your statutory agent is and make sure it's not someone that died 6 years ago. So that's a very simple thing if you're a board member that I suggest you do once a year at the beginning of the program year, just to verify what it says there. Now, this new booster group that we've created, the next step is going to be going to the IRS. We're going to have to go to the IRS to get an EIN, a Federal Employee Identification Number. And that's going to be this unique identifier that follows our group forevermore. That takes about 3 minutes. But the next thing that we're going to do with the IRS takes a little bit longer. And we're going to ask them to be treated as a tax-exempt entity. The IRS is the only entity that tells groups whether they can be tax exempt or not. There are many different kinds of tax exempt groups. There are the Chamber of Commerce is tax exempt. Homeowners Association is tax exempt. The Eagles Club is tax exempt. But what we want to be, the type of tax exempt group we want to be, is a 501c3, which is a charity, the only type of tax exempt group that can accept tax deductible contributions. So we're going to apply to be a 501c3, and we're going to have to convince the IRS that we exist to help a broad range of people, and that there's not personal benefit involved, and it's not just members are the only ones that benefit. So for instance, I could start a charity, I could form a foundation rather to give scholarships to all of my family members. They would all be very grateful for that, but the IRS would not say that that is an appropriate tax exempt purpose to be a 501c3. But if I change the purpose of my group to giving scholarships to graduates from Marion County, because that's an undefined group of beneficiaries, very broad, they will say, okay, that meets our requirements. So once we find out that we have been granted tax exempt status as a 501c3, every year we're going to have to file a 990, which is an informational tax return with the IRS. Now you can check to make sure that nothing has happened to your IRS status by once a year at the beginning of your program year. You can go to irs.gov, and they just changed their website around, and you can look up entities by name or by EIN that are it's permitted for them to accept tax deductible contributions. So look up your group, make sure it still says, yes, indeed, you are still entitled to accept tax deductible contributions. Now you're going to have this ongoing connection with the IRS every year by filing this 990. And depending on how large your organization is, the form will ask for increasing amounts of information as your organization gets bigger. So the 990N or 990 postcard filing, which it used to be called, but it's not a postcard. It's now all online and it's check marks, basically, very quick if you're a small organization. Then there's a 990 easy, and then there's the full 990, which if you're a larger organization, tells the public how you spent money, how you operated, what kind of program service expenses you had. So if you fail to file that 990 after 3 years, that's an automatic revocation of your tax exempt status. You don't want that to happen. So every year, go into the irs.gov, make sure it says that you are still qualified to accept tax deductible contributions for Anywhere boosters. Now, there's one large category of organization that does not have to ask the IRS for permission to be treated as a tax exempt group. That's exclusively religious organizations. So churches, temples, mosques, synagogues, they do not have to go through the same process that other charities do. But absent that, this is the process that you'll be doing. And there are plenty of training materials on the IRS's webpage that can help expand on some of those things. And then finally, if you're an Ohio charity or a charity that solicits Ohioans for contributions, you need to make a filing in my office, the Attorney General's office. Now, if you're an exclusively religious group, you're exempt from this requirement, just like you're exempt from the IRS requirements. So within 6 months of forming Anywhere boosters or prior to starting solicitation, I'm going to need to go into the automatic online system for our registration and provide a filing. We're going to ask the first time that you provide some documents that we're going to have you upload and we'll keep for the life of the organization. But after that, you'll just be doing some updates. And every year you're going to have to do a filing in my office. The filing is due the exact same date as the 990 filing. We're going to I'll show you in a moment what that page looks like. But those are 3 governmental entities that, unless you're a church, temple, synagogue, you're going to need to have an ongoing relationship with and always be mindful of your responsibilities to interact with these 3 entities in the required way. So unfortunately, we run into this situation far too commonly. I'm going to actually ask, because I'm going to make some guesses if anyone, I'm going to turn off my sharing for a minute. Has anyone ever been involved in a situation in which this happened? Because it happens in every community. Okay, Betsy, thank you. Let me take a guess. Was the person involved someone that people worked a lot with and was very familiar to everybody involved with the group? Mm-hmm. Yes. And when this happened, was it a heartbreaking situation for everybody?
Yeah, it actually wasn't uncovered right away. And the person was smart enough to cover their tracks so that a routine audit didn't pick it up. So it was especially painful.
It's extraordinarily painful. And so I always ask if people have a situation like this, because take it from Betsy, it's something you don't want to ever go through. It's painful in countless ways. So usually it's someone that people trust. People would never in a million years believe that Mrs. Smith would do this to the group. Like, she's been there a long while, committed, just like everybody else, a friend. And so you feel this sense of personal betrayal. You often feel guilty that this happened on your clock while you were in charge and supposed to be watching the kids, so to speak. There's a financial loss that comes along with this, and sometimes groups never recover from that because the money may not be recovered. And then sometimes there's a reputational loss involved where people begin to doubt the sincerity of the work of your organization. Do you have can you elaborate anything that might be helpful, Betsy?
I actually just wanted to add like an important piece of learning that we gained from it, which is that after the person wasn't there, somebody asked an employee who had reported to that person, did Sally Jane ever ask you to do anything that made you feel uncomfortable? And the person who had been like kept in fear said, well, now that you mention it, here are a couple of things I found to be irregular. And then following that trail, that's how it got uncovered. So I guess, what am I trying to say? And this is an organization that's super diligent about its finances. So it goes to show that someone who's enterprising in a criminal direction knows how to manipulate people to keep them quiet. And unfortunately, if all those smarts were used for good, this person could have achieved some wonderful things.
So one of my jobs, when we discover thefts as a part of our investigations, but sometimes organizations discover them on their own and may have gone to the police for criminal charges. And we read one of these articles, and if we don't know about it, I usually reach out to the organization and I want to know, what did the person do? How did they do it? And most importantly, have you adopted any changes or policy and procedure adjustments that would prevent this from happening in the future? How did your person end up harming the organization? What techniques did they use?
They set up vendor accounts, or a vendor account or a bank account that actually were going to them. And then we're able to make disbursements. They forged a board president's signature. So when under audit, everything matched up. There was a disbursement, there was a signature. So again, this was not a dumb person,
Right.
but it was about $80,000. The agency did recover it. But again, it goes to show that it's possible, even in a relatively good system, for somebody to take advantage.
Well, the other thing you mentioned that I want to reinforce so that people hear it is, I think you said that you have audits and that this didn't show up in an audit. Many people say, I don't need to worry about this because we have an audit. Audits are not designed to find fraud. That's not the purpose of having an audit. An audit is designed to say, this snapshot of the financial health of the organization seems to be accurate. They may discover fraud, but that is not the primary purpose of it. So some people place a lot of priority on having an audit, believing that relieves them from their absolute duty to have internal controls in place that make this sort of thing far more difficult to discover. And if it does happen, that you discover it more quickly, because the longer it goes on, the damages mount and grow exponentially. And so what I find when I'm reaching out to organizations, when this has happened to them, is this concept that they're shocked that this happened to them, because this person you never would have guessed would have done this. And so we who are involved in the charitable sector are often involved because we have a generous spirit. We want to be caring towards others. And so we have this capacity to trust people. But trust is not an internal control. And this can happen to all kinds of organizations. And so I often in trainings talk about some of our church cases, because I try to convince people that if these things can go wrong in a church where we're all supposed to be on our best behavior, then it can also go wrong in any other kind of group. And so we've had some big cases with churches. And I've called, and there's this tiny little church that was up northeast in Beach City. No, Ohio City, Beach City. Is there a Beach City? I think over towards Canton, maybe. It's a tiny little curve in one of the state highways. And it was a Methodist church, and they lost $200,000. The church almost went belly up and had to be rescued. What had happened? They had a bookkeeper who I called, and they said, well, she just kept making deposits. She would move funds from the church account into her personal account. I said, well, did she like disguise it with vendors or with fake employees? Because using ghost vendors and ghost employees is a common strategy often used in fraud. No, she just merely boldly transferred the money from her account, from the church account to her account. The sad thing about this is, had they been using any sort of internal control process, if one other person would have taken a look at the bank account information, the online accounts, they would have seen these transfers and could have asked a question about, hey, what's this all about? And just knowing that there's someone else looking over your shoulder can be sometimes enough to prevent these headaches. I was in the western part of the state once, and someone said that their bank contacted their church and said, did you realize that on Monday mornings when you make deposits of what comes in on the collection plate, you never have $10 bills? And they said, no, in fact, we never even thought about that. So the next Sunday, they throw some $10 bills in the various collection plates. And sure enough, on the report that gets made, there were no $10 bills to deposit. And that's because they had one usher who always counted the collection plate out, and he always took the $10 bills as a personal tithe to himself. Now, there wasn't enough there that truly damaged the church, and with cash gifts like that, you never really know that they're coming. But if they'd had one other person involved in counting the money, and you should always have two unrelated people involved in counting the cash, that wouldn't have happened, because it's far more difficult to talk two people into engaging in something like that. I happen to be a Baptist, just like Mr. Love is, and my favorite church case to talk about was a major Baptist church down in Cincinnati. And they had, it was a very large church with multiple accounts and multiple investment accounts, and they had some very visible community leaders, including their treasurer. And he would put together for their council meetings these lovely reports, and he would staple copies of the bank statements for each of their accounts that they had. But it turns out that the church treasurer had a significant problem that his wife discovered. He had a problem with escorts and pornography. And so he would take money from these accounts, and he would use Adobe Pro, make alterations to the bank statements, hiding the money he had stolen, and then turn in these fraudulent bank statements to the church council meetings. He's in prison now.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. They stopped the audit at $1.1 million.
Wow.
So because this went on for so long, you know, the damage can increase. What they didn't have is someone else involved in double checking what was going on. And with online banking, it cannot be easier to have someone else going in, double checking that there aren't any transactions that haven't been accounted for, and that sort of thing. And some people fear that they might be insulting Mrs. Smith, who has been a loyal volunteer for so many years. It's not insulting Mrs. Smith to insist on developing processes like this. In fact, it helps Mrs. Smith. So I was elected the treasurer at my church, and Mr. Love may know something about this, but in my tradition, once you're elected treasurer, you never get out of it until you move or die. So I was not interested in serving a life term as treasurer at my church. Now, I also did not want to do anything that would hurt the church. I'd rather have my family's checking account hurt rather than the church account. I also did not want people at church saying, oh, Beth just got a new car. Isn't that interesting? She is the treasurer. You know, I wanted people to know that I took the job seriously, and we didn't have many firmed up policies and procedures. So we took some time to think about what does it look like to do the job responsibly. And so we determined that the treasurer should prepare a report that had this information on it. But before it went to our council each month, that report was going to be double checked by 2 of 5 people who had access to all our accounts. So they would go through, double check what I was sharing. They would validate that there were no additional expenditures out of the accounts or any funny money. Most importantly, if I had made an error, I wanted to know about it. I wanted to be able to correct it. Now, it ended up working out great. It no longer felt like, as the treasurer, I was starting from scratch and having to make things up. It felt like there was a process and I wasn't on my own. And most importantly, I'm no longer the treasurer. Yay! So when you have these kinds of processes in place, it protects the organization, it protects the people doing these really important roles, and it makes it easier for others to feel more comfortable stepping in to fulfill those roles in the future. And so it may take some time to think through what kinds of activities does our group engage in, and what processes do we need in place to make sure we're living up to our obligation to protect those funds and protect the assets that we have been entrusted with. The question of thefts going on in charities is heartbreaking. It is absolutely heartbreaking, and it hurts those people that you are all committing time in trying to help. It can set a group back enormously, but with online stuff now, it's far easier than ever before, and it only takes marginally more time and effort to do things the right way than to take shortcuts. And it's our legal obligation. So we have an absolute legal duty when we're on the board of an organization or a key employee to make sure that we have these kinds of procedures in place. And that one booklet that I talked about in the very beginning about avoiding theft in your nonprofit, it includes some 20 different kinds of approaches or processes that you might want to think about implementing on your group. And this will depend greatly on what kinds of activities your group does. We have a number of online platforms now like GoFundMe and PayPal, and many groups have done a good job of ensuring that there are people double checking bank statements, but those online platforms are just like bank statements. And so we have had a number of organizations in the last, it seems, year or so where there wasn't the same sort of internal control developed for that, like, oh, we'll collect the booster membership fees through PayPal. And for some reason, people don't think, like, PayPal doesn't feel the same as a bank account, but it really is. And there have been many situations where someone has helped themselves to the PayPal funds and not turned it all over to the charitable account like it should be. So you need to always be thinking about how your operations are changing and whether you need to refine them in some way to account for these kinds of changes in operations. You're never done doing this. And again, these processes are there also to protect the people doing it, as opposed to suggesting that you distrust people. It actually helps you feel far more secure. Anyone have any words of wisdom to share about this sort of thing?
Beth, I have a whole bunch of questions.
Okay.
All right, and everyone, please feel free to jump on. Beth, are there any donations that a nonprofit cannot or should not accept? For example,
Cocaine.
can a nonprofit accept donations from a marijuana dispensary, bingo money, just to name a few?
So a charity cannot engage in illegal conduct. So not okay to start, selling drugs on the side to raise money, or to run an escort service. You have to follow all the laws. So I would have no problem saying that it's not illegal to accept from a legal marijuana distribution facility. There's nothing illegal about accepting bingo money. But boards can have discussions about what kinds of gifts they want to accept and don't want to accept. And sometimes that may be, maybe your group does not have the capacity to properly handle the transfer of titles if someone gave you a car or a boat. Because you need to do some paperwork to make sure that the donor's name gets taken off and it's rightly put into the title of whoever ends up with that car. So you can have a policy saying, you know what, we're not going to accept titled gifts. You may also have a discussion on your board about what types of donors you're willing to accept from or not accept from. So if you're with a substance abuse counseling group, maybe you say, you know what, we're not going to accept money from the liquor industry because they're the ones that got our clients to this position they're in. On the other hand, it's perfectly appropriate to say, you know what, the problem is huge. We'll take money from whoever gives it to us. So those are just board decisions that have to be made. Now, I will tell you that I used to work for the American Cancer Society. I was the state director of communications and marketing. And the American Cancer Society does Relay for Life and making strides against breast cancer. They have team-based fundraising from very enthusiastic volunteers. God bless the volunteers and their energies. But the American Cancer Society has a very firm policy about not accepting tobacco-related money. And so there was, in Columbus, there's a major Kraft Foods warehouse. They were part of Philip Morris, which then became Altria. We did not accept any gifts from Kraft. So they were very firm on this policy position that they had taken about not accepting tobacco-related gifts. We also had sometimes volunteers in their enthusiasm. I remember a volunteer was setting up a fundraising event at a tobacco shop in Toledo. It was going to be a smoke out cancer event. It's like, I'm sorry. Thank you for your interest, but the American Cancer Society logo does not go next to the tobacco store logo. Not something we do, but thank you. Had another occasion in which someone wanted to do a topless car wash to support breast cancer research. That was another, I thank you for your enthusiasm, but the American Cancer Society logo does not go next to topless car wash. And so those are kinds of decisions that board members can talk about and decide how their group wants to respond. There's no right or wrong answer on those kinds of questions.
Thank you. Beth, can family members of paid staff serve on the same organization's board of directors?
Yes, they can. So when you have related board members, you have now bought yourself some conflict of interest situations. We always like to see plenty of independent board members who are not related and don't have the same last name, because that means you're getting a broader perspective and better ideas. So when you do have family members on boards, and particularly if you have an employee situation, you need to be very mindful of conflict of interest and making sure that people who have an interest in issues are not involved in voting on them. You want independent outsiders to be involved in those decisions. So for instance, the Bill Gates Foundation may well have members of the Gates family on it. So they have to be very mindful of any potential conflict of interest issues so that they can assure the public that outside people are having the making the call in those situations.
Thank you. How often should a nonprofit update its bylaws, policies, and procedures?
Always. How often? So I think every year at the beginning of the program year, after you make those contacts with the 3 agencies that I suggested, I think all board members ought to take a look at your bylaws. You ought to be familiar with what's in them. You ought to make sure that there's a planning process to get things on the calendar. If it says that you're going to have an annual meeting of all members in November, then you got to get this on the planning calendar. If it no longer makes sense to have a membership meeting in November, then you can change the bylaws, which probably include discussion on how you go about doing that. So it should always be on the table because you must comply with it. But if it no longer matches with your current needs, then you can take care of that by amending them.
Should board members have term limits?
You should be like a college professor doing Socratic method and seeing how we all respond. So you're asking a question that there also is no necessarily right or wrong answer about term limits. People have different perspectives on that. There is something that folks nationally are concerned about, and the baby boomer generation is starting to age out, and many people are concerned about whether there are adequate number of people prepared to step into leadership positions, both on the board and at the staff level. If we fail to include younger people in the operations and leadership of charities, then we will not be able to easily respond to those challenges when people step aside. Just like I saw Sarah's very cute partner coming in and helping her. Like, we need to keep evolving and being responsive as times change. One of the things that I've seen happen, maybe it never happens in Lorraine, but in other places you decide, oh, we're going to commit to having younger people, and then when they provide suggestions, then the answer becomes, well, we've never done it that way before. That's a pretty big slap in the face that can really discourage people from stepping in and being involved. And so it requires a commitment from everybody on the board to be open about listening to new ideas. Diversity is a huge issue. We should be doing much, much better in the charitable community in the state of Ohio, ensuring that we have diversity of all kinds on our boards. When we do that, we benefit then from the wide range of experiences and expertise that people have, and we can come to better decisions about the direction of groups. So that is a long-winded way of saying that board limits, there are important issues that are included in that topic.
Thank you, Beth. At the Community Foundation, we ask these questions in our grant application, and when we do not see board limits, it's a long conversation that we have in considering the grant application. And also when we see family members on the board of an organization, that becomes a red flag for us as well. Thank you. What are some of the ways a nonprofit could lose its tax-exempt status besides not filing with the IRS for 3 years?
Well, Professor, there are several ways that you could lose your tax-exempt status. One good way, I don't know if any of you noticed, but there was an election that took place recently. One thing that 501c3s are prohibited from doing is endorsing candidates or making contributions to campaign committees. That is supposed to get you an instant revocation from the IRS, but you may also face action from my office where we may take groups to court and close down the charity if we don't think that they are actually committed to providing program services in the community. So there are, frankly, failing to abide by the fiduciary duties that we're going to go over in a minute or two can buy you a do not get out of jail free card from either us or the IRS. And the fact of the matter is, frankly, that you have a bigger chance of hearing from the Ohio Attorney General than you do from the IRS about issues concerning tax-exempt entities.
Thank you. I've been monopolizing this. Does anyone have any questions? Not? Well, don't be
She's
shy.
up, isn't she?
I'm not taking notes. Okay, I am, but I mean, I'm not taking notes about you. So Beth, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
All righty, so all that is for me to beg you all to live up to your number one duty when you're a board member or charitable leader, and that is to make sure that you have internal controls in place that protect those resources you've been entrusted with. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. Let me see if I can get my sharing screen thing working again. Okay. Well, so Linda's last question actually gives me a chance to talk about what we do. We get complaints in our office every day of the week from people throughout the state who have a concern about how a charitable organization is operating. It may be someone who is a beneficiary of the charity. It could be someone who's an employee. It could be just a community member with concerns. And it could be a board member. We do license bingo, and we'll talk briefly about that in a moment or two. And sometimes we get a complaint saying, you know, they were just not very nice to me last Tuesday night at the bingo game. Well, that complaint is going to get a very different response than a complaint that says, I'm on the board of an organization. My fellow board members and I have asked the executive director and the treasurer for financial reports routinely, and they fail to share any information with us. That is going to get a very serious look from my office. And so we have on our staff compliance examiners, accountants, investigators, and lawyers. We have the authority to ask for documentation, to do interviews, and the results of one of our investigations could be that we find we don't find any evidence of what might have been alleged, and we close it and move on to something else. Sometimes we may not be able to find what was alleged, but we find a group that does not have its board governance practices in the place where it should be. So we will provide them technical support to get them to the place where they should be able to operate safely into the future. Sometimes we file litigation, and we may file litigation to recover funds that have been misspent, to kick certain people off the board, to even close down an organization. And then sometimes we work with local law enforcement on criminal penalties connected with what we find. By the way, we don't have any in our office, has no criminal authority unless we are requested by local law enforcement. So local police or the local county prosecutor may call us and ask to assist in the investigation or to maybe handle the whole case. And so upon request, we can be involved criminally. So it just depends on what we find when we start these investigations in terms of what the outcome might be. So if you have concerns about a charity in your community, let us know. The one thing that we really want to do, which became, I think evident in the discussion we had about internal controls, is the longer problems go on, the bigger the damage gets. So we want to be able to turn off the leak as quickly as possible so that we can protect charitable funds. So, heaven knows that there are far too many needs out there that go unanswered by charities doing, fabulous work. So having it leak outside the sector and being used to buy those chariots and coats of armor doesn't help anybody. So the faster we can do something to protect funds, the better off we all are. So we go through complaints every week and decide what our best next step might be. I mentioned our online registration system, and you'll find that at our new webpage. We always suggest that at least 3 people with every organization have an account in our registration system, because when you have a personal account in our registration system, you can link yourself to 1 or more charities, and we will send you an email reminder every time a filing is due for a charity. We will send you a copy of any sort of filing that anyone does on behalf of that organization. So if Susie Smith has made an annual report, also changed the mailing address to her home address, and there's no good reason for that to have happened, there is a good reason for people who are trying to capture bank accounts and take control of organizations in a way that's inappropriate. That could be a reason you reach out to us. So The other thing that having multiple people involved in is when Mrs. Smith finally gets to retire to Florida, sometimes everyone doesn't know everything that Mrs. Smith did for the group. And so if there are other people that get the reminder emails, then it hopefully doesn't fall through the cracks. We advise the public that using our research charities function can be a good way to make sure that you're dealing with charities that are at least minimally compliant with their legal obligations to do filings with us. And so you could tell vendors or businesses in your community, check us out on the Attorney General's webpage. You'll see that we're properly registered. You can search by name of the organization or by the EIN, and hopefully they're in our database, and there will be some information about how to contact, like demographic information about the group. And then here's a very important one: is the organization's registration status current, yes or no? It should always say yes. If it says no and you have an account in the system, you can go to the to-do page. It'll tell you exactly what's missing. And many funding organizations, such as foundations or United Way and government groups, will not release funds to organizations unless it says yes here. Is that the way you do it in at the foundation?
Yes.
Linda?
Yes.
Yay! Thank you for that. And then we'll also provide information about some of the financial information they shared with us. And I'll just leave it at that. Let me let you know about some statutory provisions that folks involved in charities ought to know about. Well, I don't know what that was. I just lost something. Here we go. And we're going to run through these fairly quickly. So the big one for us is the Charitable Trust Act, which is at Ohio Revised Code Chapter 109. And it's the one that says that charitable trusts have to register with our office. And many people say, well, I'm not a charitable trust. I don't have to register with you. I didn't come from probate court. There's no big, bequest that was made. But a charitable trust is actually defined really broadly. So it's any time that there's an entity that is holding assets that folks have been led to believe that when they hand them over to you, they'll be used for some sort of charitable, religious, or educational purpose. It does not require you to be incorporated. It does not require you to be a tax-exempt entity. You could be a for-profit business and be a charitable trust that would need to register with us. Clearly, all 501c3s need to register with us. And many people think that if I don't do these other filings that other charitable organizations do, I can fly under the radar and commit fraud. But I'm here to tell you that if you walk like a duck and quack like a duck, we have jurisdiction to treat you like a duck. And if you are stealing money and embezzling it when it should have been used for a charitable purpose, whether you've filed things or not, we can come after you and put a stop to it. 109 creates the registration and gives us power to investigate, take enforcement actions, makes us involved in certain kinds of transactions and litigation. Another main part of our work focuses on the Solicitation Act, which is at Ohio Revised Code 1716. And it applies anytime there's an appeal used for a charitable purpose. Doesn't matter if it's a written request, if it's an oral request, if it's door knockers, if it's standing outside a community event with a milk jug. It could be bingo games. It could be selling food at a community festival to support scholarships. It could be a spaghetti benefit dinner. Those are all types of solicitations. And the one thing that is an absolute that's very confusing for some people is you're not allowed to lie to raise money for charities. And unfortunately, we find many people are far too willing to take advantage of the generosity of others. And so 1716 is what says you cannot mislead people to raise funds. The other thing that's in 1716, and I think Wendy might have some questions here, It also controls the activities of professional solicitors who are paid by charities to raise funds on their behalf. So think telemarketers, direct mail people. They have to be registered annually with us. They have to be bonded. They provide us copies of the contracts they have with charities. They too are bound by the thou shalt not lie to raise money for a charity. So most people don't have a problem with 1716 because it's apparent to them that you can't lie when you're raising money. But this is the big statute that is used most commonly when we have those kinds of problems. Any questions about this?
Well, this is Wendy. I kind of wanted to go back when you said that a for-profit can register in the online charitable registration system. What does that look like? I mean,
so let's say it's like this. Let's say that let's say there's a chain of garages, motor places or something in your community. They decide they want to start raising money to support breast cancer research. So they put jars out, or maybe they have some other, roundup to support breast cancer research. They have created a charitable trust because they're raising and holding these funds for a charitable purpose. So they must register with us, and they must use the money in the way that donors thought that it was going to be used. Does that help?
It does. So if a for-profit agency gives some kind of banquet and they want to donate all the money to a scholarship fund, or they want to donate the money to breast cancer awareness or whatsoever, they need to register as a charitable trust before or after they do this?
Okay, let me help here, because here's the way that gets most of those activities out of our registration circle. Most commonly, they are doing these kinds of fund development activities in partnership with a charity. So they are just like a bona fide volunteer for that charity. They don't have to register. Okay. So it's just like American Cancer Society have all those Relay for Life volunteers. They are volunteers for the American Cancer Society. They do not have to register on their own because the American Cancer Society is overseeing their activities. And that could include local businesses and things like that. But the example I gave you did not mention a specific charity.
Okay.
And so the other thing to be mindful of, and we have some sad stories about that, is that if someone is raising funds on your behalf, they need to have written permission from you. And then you need to know how it's being done and that you're getting your fair share at the end. We have had to take action against some people who claim they're raising funds for the James Cancer Hospital at Ohio State. The James Cancer Hospital has never heard of them and got no money from it. Mm-hmm. So that's why we assume that charities are, you're working, trying to raise all kinds of volunteers to support your work in many kinds of ways, and you're in charge of that. Good luck. You need to know what's going on though, so that people aren't misusing the name of your group and you're not benefiting from it. All right. Did that help?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Nonprofit corporation.
Can I ask one question? I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
It took me a while to unmute it. So I have kind of a tricky question, and maybe this isn't the place to bring it, but I'm going to ask you. I'm on a for-profit board, and I also belong to a nonprofit, but this doesn't have anything to do with my nonprofit I work with. But I'm on a for-profit board, and the for-profit board wants to have a fundraiser to do something in like our community. So it's for a homeowners association. Is that legal to have a fundraiser? Because I don't think it is, and I want to ask an expert on that.
Okay, so you're doing a fundraiser for a homeowners association, which is not a charity.
Right.
Go for it.
So we can, it's legal to do that.
Yeah.
How do you, then do you just have to have those funds for the specific thing you're fundraising for?
Yeah, so, you can, it wouldn't be surprising to me during this COVID time that there may be little buckets and jars at many small businesses saying, anyone want to help out and support, our employees, put your money here. Perfectly appropriate. That is not a charitable solicitation. So the key part is whether it's charitable or not. And what you're describing is not charitable, but there's nothing that prohibits it. Now, if you had told me that your for-profit business wanted to do a fundraiser to support cancer services, then you need to, in advance, get permission from a specific cancer charity and have that written agreement about what's going to happen, how our fund's going to be protected, and that sort of thing. That is a charitable solicitation, and you need to be doing it in cooperation under control of the charity.
Okay,
so do you see the difference
I
there?
do, and thank you so much for clarifying that.
Yeah.
So Beth,
Anything else on that?
Beth, I have a question. I think that there's certainly people can raise money, but if I were to make a donation to either Wendy's example or Natalie's example, I cannot take a charitable deduction.
Absolutely correct. So the other thing that goes on a lot is you'll see GoFundMe accounts for someone who may have, experienced a fire or some sort of tragedy. It may be a very nice thing to give money to help that individual, but that is not a charitable solicitation. It has to be kind of the broad, undefined beneficiary.
Thank you.
And it's not deductible.
And just so people know that the community foundation can only make grants to 501c3 tax exempt organizations. Thank you.
Yes. 1702 is the Nonprofit Corporation Act, which I had always recommended as good bedtime reading. It's very dull. However, it has been a huge lifesaver since COVID-19 became part of our life. So when we all were initially sent home back in March, I thought it would just be for 2 weeks, but obviously I was wrong. We weren't allowed to have gatherings. We weren't allowed to have meetings. And so we wanted to let charities know 1702 has default language in it. So if your bylaws are silent to particular issues, there might be an answer in 1702 about how your organization can respond. So for instance, 1702 allows you to use Zoom, teleconference, and all these platforms we're using now to have board meetings unless your bylaws specifically prohibit it. So that was a way we were encouraging boards to continue doing your work. Do not look at these stay-at-home periods as a time to, lay back and do nothing. It may be even more important than ever to be strategic, and you are permitted to use all these kinds of platforms for meetings unless your bylaws specifically prohibit it. And if they do, you can call us and we will help talk you out of that problem so that you can continue doing work to live up to your duties to the organization and the cause. So while I used to poo-poo 1702 and just rush through it on my trainings, it has been very, very important in the last several months. And then gambling. And we're going to touch back on some of those solicitation questions. So it wasn't that long ago when Ohio was a non-gambling state, before we had casinos and racinos. And the General Assembly carved out a number of ways for charities to make use of gaming strategies to raise resources. One of those is bingo, and we licensed bingo. And when I started in 2008, there was $1.3 million spent on bingo the previous year in the state of Ohio. $1.3 billion. That's a lot of bingo. One of the things that happens a lot is it's an all cash business, which sticky fingers can often walk out with. So we have something called Bingo School where we do training. We used to do it around the state. Now we're doing it virtually. to try to teach charitable leaders about the importance of record keeping and how to make sure that your group truly is going to benefit from it. You must have a license to use bingo as a fundraiser. Bingo includes the standard B4, O72, the games that we learned in kindergarten, but it also includes instant bingo tickets, which look like little lottery tickets, and you crack the back open and it tells you whether you've won money. The big money is actually in the instant tickets. If you are using bingo, even purse bingo as a fundraiser, it requires a license. That's what's in 2915. We will help you get a license and help you know how to do that. So the other thing that we get questions every day about are raffles. So if I wanted to raffle my husband's antique motorcycle off to help support breast cancer research, that would be an illegal raffle. However, if I went to the Stephanie Spielman Center at the Ohio State James Cancer Hospital and said, here's what I'd like to do, and they agree that this is something they'd like to undertake, and it becomes their raffle that I am involved in promoting, that's a legal raffle. So people and businesses are not permitted to have raffles. However, charities can, so it has to be owned and operated by the charity. 2915 also permits charities to have casino nights and those sorts of things. However, there are very specific rules in 2915 about how it can be done. You can never have it at a restaurant or a hotel. They can only be held at a facility owned by the charity or leased from a government or veteran organization. There are limitations on how often they can be had and restrictions on what can happen there. So you are never allowed to play craps and roulette at a charitable gaming casino night activity. Something really horrible must happen with craps and roulette. I have no idea what, but the General Assembly specifically prohibits craps and roulette at these gatherings. So if you're going to engage in these kinds of activities with your charity, be sure to take a look at 2915 and do it the right way. Now, the other thing to know, all these guidelines are in Chapter 29 of Ohio's Revised Code. Chapter 29 is Ohio's criminal code. So this falls right in between murder and drug trafficking. And if you don't do it the right way, there can be criminal consequences. And as I mentioned before, we are not the gambling police. It's your township police, municipal police, sheriff's deputy that can write up criminal violations if you're not doing a raffle appropriately, if you're not doing a casino night appropriately. So it won't matter what Beth Short says. It matters what your local law enforcement says in terms of whether they might write up a criminal violation. And that's certainly not something you want your charity to get, headlines for. So make sure you're doing this the right way. And again, on the raffle, it's somewhat like the same thing that I talked about in 1716. That raffle of my husband's motorcycle, if it's done through the Stephanie Spielman Center and it's their raffle, not mine personally, that makes it a legitimate raffle. People and businesses can't do it, but the charity can. Is that clear? All right.
Yeah, I have a in general question about nonprofit. So,
Okay.
So I'm transitioning into a nonprofit, and I have received the state Secretary of State nonprofit the EIN number and the state status. So I'm pending the exemption for the 501. Wow, I can't speak. The 501c3 exemption. However, am I still like a nonprofit to some degree right now, or what?
So you've incorporated the name of a charitable organization.
Yes, ma'am.
And you now are waiting to hear from the IRS about whether they're going to grant you tax exempt status as a 501c3.
Correct.
You should do a filing in my office right now, because before you start soliciting for money, you need to be filed in my office.
So Even though I haven't gotten the 501c3.
Correct.
So,
And you'll finish the when you do get that letter from the IRS, you'll send it to us when you get it.
okay.
Now, the funny thing is, they had been processing, prior to COVID, they had been processing their requests quite quickly and routinely. And then when COVID hit, they couldn't figure out how to handle mail. And so there were semi-truckloads full of unopened mail in front of all their campuses.
Oh, God.
So stuff that could be done all electronically, they were keeping up with fairly well. But if you made a mistake or something in the paperwork, or they had to contact you, there's been delays. So the time that it's going to take is going to be variable right now, and we get that. And you are a charitable trust right now for sure.
Okay.
And so you have all these obligations. You've got to follow the law. You've got to, not mislead people and all that sort of thing, while you wait for this piece of paperwork to get finalized. But I would go ahead and file in my office, and then you'll be in the system and can tell people, hey, look, we're in the statewide charity system. Check us out.
So do I file at the, on that online charitable trust that I talked about just a minute ago?
Yes,
Okay. All right, thank you.
sure. I'm going to stop my sharing for a minute because I want to take a look at our leader, Linda. Linda, I think we were going to end at 7:30, and I didn't even get to the fiduciary duties in terms of discussing what it looks like when you look at that sort of thing. So I wonder what you would like to do at this point. We could stop here now. I can come back later some other time and we can jump into what it looks like, these 4 duties that we talk about. I can give you all a teaser about why it's so very fascinating to take a look at our booklet on fiduciary duties or the recording that we have, or we can field some other questions. So tell me what would be most useful to everybody.
So Beth, how long will it take you to cover the fiduciary responsibilities?
It generally takes 20, 30 minutes, depending on questions.
By a show of hands, how many people can stay or want to stay for it?
Well, I don't, me personally, I don't want her to rush through that part because that's kind of, I want to be able to ask, field some questions. So if that means ending and coming back, I prefer that so that we can ask questions and get a real, thorough examination of what you're saying, because that's kind of like real important.
Okay.
And let me
All
add,
right, let's ask some.
let me
I'm
add that
sorry.
there is that pre-recorded version of my webinar if you're not interested in coming back later. And I am going to send this PowerPoint to Linda so she can distribute it. So I feel bad that we didn't get through as much information, but I thought we had valuable discussion, which I thought was interesting. And sometimes I think that's more important than my slides. So I'm happy to do whatever is most useful to people.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, Beth, could you please send us the recording? And Wendy has a lot of questions that she could probably reach out to you one-on-one. Is that right? Since we posted
Sure.
your email. All right. So Wendy, you don't have to wait for us to schedule another session. Stacy has a quick question. She doesn't have, her mic is not working. So Stacy says, if you give a gift as a thank you for donating, how do you acknowledge that gift and donation to the donor? So if the donation was $50 and the gift, the value of the gift to the donor was $5, Is their tax deductible donation $45 or $50? And it's not an auction.
And it's not, oh, see, that is a very smart person who throws in the little, and it's not an auction. Because
Can you see the chat?
I do. So that would be something to take a look at the IRS webpage. They have a whole section on what they refer to as quid pro quo contributions. So there's probably a limitation on what they might just consider de minimis. And my guess is a $5 tchotchke is not going to trigger that sort of requirement. It most often applies to if you go to a gala dinner and you paid $200 for a ticket and yet the meal costs $75, you will likely get a letter from the sponsor saying, thank you so much for coming. And for your records, $125 of your contribution is deductible because you got something of value for $75 instead of for the charity to make use of. So the question is, does $5 actually trigger that requirement? I don't know, but a quick look at irs.gov will tell you that. My guess is that it needs to be more substantial than $5 because lots of people give out coffee mugs or, plastic drinking bottles and things like that. There might be someone on that actually knows the exact answer to that. Anyone have that? Liz? Nope. So look at the quid pro quo contributions that's discussed on the IRS website. Now, it's also interesting that she said it wasn't from an auction. I wasn't thinking of auctions, but raffle tickets are not deductible for people that buy raffle tickets, FYI. So that's because that's actually a benefit because you're buying a chance at winning something for yourself. And so that is not a tax deductible contribution when someone buys raffle tickets.
Thank you, Beth. So we are almost at 7:30. I will send out that recording you have on fiduciary responsibilities. I'm not sure when we'll be able to schedule another session, but Beth, thank you for giving out your email so that people can reach out to you personally with their unique organization's questions. And then depending on the kind of response I get about scheduling another session, we'll try and follow up on this. Beth, do you have any last words of advice to us?
Well, thanks for spending this Thursday evening talking about board governance. I think it's all exciting stuff, but what's more exciting is the work that you all are doing to make your communities better. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
And 3 cheers for BBU.
Thank you,
I'm a
Beth.
big fan.
Thank you.
All righty.
Have a
See
great
you all.
have a great evening, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.